you have this loss of surplus given by this triangle over here. And we started to talk about the responses that government can have in such a case. How does government deal with a situation where there is this natural monopoly? And as I mentioned in our live session on Tuesday, it turns out that some of the industries that were originally thought to be natural monopolies are not necessarily so. Naturally, one of the responses government can have is to privatize. Some of the other possible responses that we discussed was the subsidization. Well, should government decide to monopolize this industry, government can just subsidize, government can reduce at QE, subsidize by the difference between price T and price PE. We talked about some of the negative effects of that. Government will have to either raise taxes to pay for that subsidy, or it would have to raise debt to pay for that subsidy, both of which are not ideal. As you know, taxes distort the prices of factors of production, and they can distort effectively the behavior of firms and households. As you know from your first year macro course, one of the ideals of a tax is that it is neutral. It's really the case that imposing changes in prices has a neutral effect on the behavior of households and firms. Debt, on the other hand, also has implications. The standard critique that government raising debt, especially excessive debt, can result in crowding out due to higher interest rates. And that is because, in effect, government, when raising debt, government is in effect distorting a different price, which is the interest rate that holds in financial markets. And this has implications for capital allocation, or what we just generically call investment. Then there was the issue of X efficiency. Now, the argument here at a sort of theoretical level is that government monopolies, government-run monopolies, don't have the same incentive as private firms do to satisfy shareholders' desires for increased profits. If shareholders are unhappy with the performance of a monopoly, and by performance we mean how much profits they are making, then the theory is that they will replace the management. Of course, management does not want to be replaced, so they are incentivized to ensure that firms are making profits, even if it's a monopoly, even if there's no competition in the market. They will invest in innovation, productivity enhancing technologies and measures. Privatization does offer an opportunity for cash windfall to government, and this was one of the sort of selling points in the past. So you could end up with a situation where a private firm ends up doing something like this, right? Shown in this graph. It's reducing supply, raising price. So some regulatory measures may be necessary to forestall that eventuality following the transfer of a public monopoly to private hands. Right. Now, there are various ways that government can regulate private monopolies in our framework. So what we want is to avoid this, because this implies a reduction in allocative efficiency. That implies a reduction in societal welfare as a consequence. So government has options in terms of regulating an industry. Recall that the privatization option would involve government maintaining production at QE and maintaining the price at PE, but then just subsidizing by this difference here, so either through taxation or borrowing, which we said is not necessarily going to be optimal for the reasons discussed there, but also because of the X inefficiency, the potential X inefficiency reasons, which in turn results in us landing at a point over here rather than at a point like that. So again, when I bring up this graph here, you should be thinking of allocative efficiency and X efficiency. X inefficiency being a point inside of the PPF, and allocative efficiency being this point of tangency between the relative price ratios and the marginal rate of product transformation in this case. If you have a monopoly, you could end up at a point over here, allocatively inefficient, right? So this line is not tangent to the PPF, which suggests allocative inefficiency. And that's what government wants to avoid. What it can do is in terms of regulating the industry, one option is capping profits of firms, but there are some issues with that, some potential responses firms have, one of which is what we call cost padding. So companies can just report profits that diverge from the actual profits, right? And they can do so by raising the costs of inputs and so on artificially. Then there's also the option of capping price, and this is perhaps a better solution. So forcing firms to price the good, say at PR, right? So PR is for regulation in this case. There's still lower supply, but higher than the outright monopoly supply. And of course, you can combine these two things, profit and price capping, which is perhaps an optimal solution. One of the other issues that comes with privatization is loss of jobs. Given recent experience, and by recent experience here, we're talking perhaps specifically about the South African case with regard to Eskom, with regard to SAA, there are other public entities that also find themselves in financial difficulties as a result of management inefficiencies. The case for privatization in the face of these difficulties does seem strong, but again, these are not easy decisions to make, and not only because of the political implications, but also because it's hard to know what the ultimate outcomes will be from privatization. And these, to the extent that the decision is taken to privatize, the state needs to be very careful in its approach to how that's done, how that's managed, and also the regulation of the privatized industry. Thus far, we've been talking about absolute monopolies, where you have one firm dominating an entire industry. But of course, the more common state of imperfect competition is the form of either monopolistic or oligopolistic industries. Under monopolistic competition, you may have many firms in the market, but in this case, each firm has some small degree of control over prices. So not price takers in the pure competition sense, right? So there is some control over prices, and this is because of perhaps slight differentiations in product offerings, right? So firms are producing close substitutes, but not perfect substitutes in a given industry. There is something distinct, even if it's just branding. Then there's oligopoly, which is the case where there are only a few firms producing similar goods or the same good. And here, each individual firm has greater control over prices. Also, in situations where you have oligopoly or even monopolistic competition, you often have, so these markets, monopolistic and oligopolistic markets, they produce equilibria that lie somewhere between the two extremes of imperfect competition and pure monopoly in the market. Okay. So if you look at that little relation at the bottom of the slide, this is sort of indicates somewhat of a spectrum of competition in the market, right? So if we look at quantity supplied in a given market, PC over here stands for perfect competition, IC for imperfect competition, and M for monopoly. You see that in a perfectly competitive market, the quantity supplied is greater than is the case in an imperfect competition, which in turn is greater than is the case in a monopolistic competition, right? So markets that are imperfectly competitive lie somewhere between the extremes of perfect competition and pure monopoly. When we look at prices, on the other hand, we notice that the market characterized by pure monopoly has the highest price, whereas a market characterized by perfect competition would have the lowest price. And then markets characterized by imperfect competition would have prices lying somewhere in between. Of course, this is all theoretical. The relation on this slide tells us basically the equilibrium. So we have the equilibrium condition where relative price ratios being tangent to marginal rate of product transformation. In the first instance, over here, you have perfect competition for Y and X, and the relative price ratio in this instance will be greater than is the case when you have imperfect competition for Y only, right? And obviously that is because of what we observe on this slide, right? So remember over here, the prices in an imperfectly competitive market will be greater than prices in a perfectly competitive market. So therefore, this ratio will necessarily be smaller, will be less than the ratio of px to py in an imperfect, perfectly competitive market, and will necessarily be smaller than the ratio px to py in a perfectly competitive market, right? That is with y being the imperfectly competitive market, okay? The good for y, sorry, the market for the good y. And then, of course, in a pure monopoly market, if y is produced by a monopoly or supplied by a monopoly, then the price will be even larger over here, and thus the value of this ratio will necessarily be smaller than is the case in just imperfect competition. All right, so what this means sort of graphically is just that the slope of the price ratio line that usually lies tangent to the production possibilities frontier is going to be effectively steeper in the case of perfect competition, and relatively flat in the case of imperfect competition, and even flatter in the case of pure monopoly, in which case, in the latter two cases, the line will in fact cut through the PPF rather than being tangent to it. So the market becomes more allocatively inefficient the more monopolistic a market is. This gives rise to the idea of a need for a regulatory authority that looks at competition in markets. Right? And most countries have such a regulatory authority, or at the very least have some legislation to that effect. Right? So in South Africa we have the Competition Act, which was promulgated. Well, we'll talk about that in a moment. But because of policymakers' concern with the degree of concentration in markets, which do encourage collusive behavior in markets, we do have competition policy in most economies. This is a graphical sort of illustration of this expression. In the perfect competition case, you have the instance where you have allocative efficiency, right? That's where the line of price ratios is tangent to the PPF. This is how much of good Y and good X is optimal in society. If you have imperfect competition in the production of Y, remember the production of Y now goes down from there to somewhere over there at point I. So you have more of X being produced relative to Y, and that is because of the assumption of maintained X efficiency. Right? So remember, every point on this curve implies X efficiency. Of course, if you have X inefficiency, it could be the case that this point I isn't on the curve, but rather is lying somewhere perhaps over here. So you have less of Y being produced, but not necessarily, which is not necessarily made up entirely by increases in X. But on this graph, you have point I here in the case of imperfect competition, which means that this is not an optimal and allocatively optimal production of bundles of Y, X and Y. In the case of monopolistic competition, it's even slightly worse. So even less of Y is being produced and even more of X is being produced. Now, you also notice that the slopes of these lines, they become flatter as you move down over here. And that is because of this expression given over here. All right, now let's talk a little bit about competition policy in closing. So the Competition Act was promulgated in South Africa in 1998. And of course, there have been a bunch of amendments over the years. The most recently, last year, in fact, I think the latest amendments were promulgated. You can think of the tribunal as almost like a court that sort of adjudicates on matters, competition matters that arise. And you can think of the Commission as almost like the prosecutor in cases of relating to competition policy, relating to collusion, etc. Now the Act was a response to relatively high concentration of ownership within industries, or at least a perceived high concentration of ownership within industries, and to sanction non-competitive behavior by firms, abuses of dominant positions in markets, etc., and also to promote competitiveness, especially for small enterprises. And some of the language that I refer to in the latest amendments speaks specifically to this issue over here of smaller enterprises. So some of the examples of actions undertaken by the Competition Commission, of cases that were sort of prosecuted or that were adjudicated. In 2002, there was a penalty imposed on Netcare in the market for market consolidation without permission from the Competition Commission. So they were buying, either buying a company or a significant stake in a company that was in the same market as themselves, and that would have made them a dominant player within the market where they exist. The Commission also fined more producers in 2005. Also, there was an investigation into bank fees. Again, the Big Four coming into the crosshairs of regulators. And there were results as there were changes in the way fees are structured as a result of this investigation. Then the big one is the fine on Tiger Brands for bread price fixing in 2007. And there are some other examples that are of interest as well. One of the examples that I've been interested in is the supposed collusion by financial firms in fixing exchange rate spreads. Okay, now we sort of made a very strong case up to now for the need for competition policy. But some people argue that there isn't really that great a need for competition policy. So textbook mentions Demsits, who makes this argument that that firms have to be efficient, right? In any market, even if it's a monopolistic market, firms have to be efficient because ultimately they will have to compete with each other. Where firms observe inefficiencies taking place in an industry as a whole, they will act on that information and enter the market and for a given good and improve efficiency and outcompete because the incentive is there to do so. Then the contestable market theorists also argue that market structure and firm size depends on the nature of the goods service produced and the nature of technology used in production. And this is a very important point as well. In sort of public policy courses, we talk about things in a very generic way, very high level way. But of course, the way industries are structured matters as well. Technology is involved. So if you go down to a lower level within any given industry, the market structure does matter. And this is why I find that that financial services case that is currently being prosecuted, as it were, by the Competition Commission is very interesting because of the nature of the market structure of financial intermediaries in South Africa. Okay, so that's where we end off with chapter 4.